Okay, good afternoon. What I'm going to do is just a fairly quick blog on the first of the shift over to the Americas from Africa. Um, so probably one of the most important things to remember when we're doing this part is that it's sort of like the Europe part, or maybe even better, the West Africa part. The break in terms of units or the break in terms of areas is a political sort of cultural thing. It's not actually a physical thing. If you look at the Americas, there's basically three chunks. There's obviously South America, you've got North America, and I suppose maybe the Caribbean would be a third, but you could argue you've got islands off of Canada, whatever. The arbitrary break where you get this idea of Latin America, which basically cuts down like this. And then also the idea of the Caribbean as a separate entity has to do with sort of, cultural, perceptual, and political stereotypes. It doesn't have to do with the actual physical geography. And it's important to remember, it really doesn't have much to do even with a lot of history. It's important to remember, if you go back to your US history, which I guess you probably got in high school, that basically all this chunk here belonged to Spain and then Mexico right into the 1840s. This belonged to France. It's this whole idea that somehow the United States is distinctive from this area further south is a stretch, and probably has more to do with 20th and 21st century attempts to make the United States a different type of place than Mexico, other than the reality when you get into the border regions of these two areas. Places like Laredo, for example, or Nogales, or even, for example, San Diego. The idea that the United States is a dramatically different system than what you find further south is a sort of a fiction. As we'll soon get into some environmental consequences, that can actually be really a problem, especially if unfortunately you're Mexico, because you're at the bottom end of this feeding chain. So first part we're going to break into is we're going to look at the Latin American Caribbean thing. In fact, what we're going to do, I'll quickly go over the sort of physical geography part. And then we'll start to go into the Caribbean, since that's in some ways, due to history and politics, is probably more distinctively different than this area. When you're looking at this region, one thing you notice, just look at literally the image here on the map, is you've got this massive line of basically a mountain chain that goes all the way down here, like a huge spine. It actually goes all the way through here, a little bit lower, and grows back up and ends up back in here all the way down to the south. This makes it really radically different than any place else on the planet. If you think of, for example, in Asia, you've got the Himalayas, you've got these different physical features, but you don't have like one continuous feature across the entire region. If you actually look at the Americas, you've basically got this massive mountain division system, which goes all the way from the southernmost tip to basically all the way up into here. In fact, all the way up into here for that matter. And when you're actually looking at this, what you're looking at is, this goes back to the idea of plate tectonics. Remember, we were talking about that a little bit with Oceania. If you look at the Pacific, the American plates, both the North and South American plates, they're moving west rather rapidly. The Pacific plate, North Pacific plate, which we're on, South Pacific plate down here, are really moving pretty slow. And you can actually start to see it if you visualize this. If you visualize this thing moving this way, and this one moving this way, and they're running into this one, because this one's really slow. It's something like someone rear-ending someone in front of them. You can really see this really dramatically here. Here's one plate. Here's the other plate. In fact, you can see where this is cracked, this plate. What's happening is this sucker is stacking up. It's basically stopped, but it keeps on moving. The pressure to move is the entire thing's moving west. It hits here, it's getting stacked up, and you see it's literally piling up. And that piling up is this. So when you look at your mountain chains in South America, you look at especially your mountain chains in North America, especially your coastal chains in the western part, if you notice, you're seeing exactly the same phenomenon. You see this whole area here. You see a plate which is moving a lot slower, and this which just keeps on running into it, 365 days a year, 24/7, millions of years, and it just sort of crashes and folds. And this is why this whole area of the Americas, this whole western area, is part of what used to, I don't know, when I was a kid, I think these calls like Ring of Fire or something like that, along with over here. Because if you notice over here, the Pacific plate, ironically, is doing the same thing as it goes further west. And of course, then what you have is this folding effect here also. What this means is when you're looking at the Americas is you have this one phenomenon that pretty much goes from far north to the far south. These mountains are all growing. So all these mountain ranges are getting taller. If you had too much free time at the end of the semester, you could get into here and you could go to one of the mountains in here in Chile. What you'd find, or I think I'm in Peru or Chile here, whichever, yeah, Chile. What you'd find is if you're standing right here, and you can measure yourself, is you'd find that in very, very small amounts, like it said Pular here, you'd find that actually that mountain's growing. So if you stood on it, you have to have a lot of free time, you would actually be going up slightly. It might also be a millimeter a year or something like that. But this sucker is larger now than it was 5,000 years ago. And that's because this area here is getting crunched with this area out here, and that's pushing this as the weak spot, the stress point. This is where everything's cracking. Think of a sheet of concrete, like on a sidewalk, and there's a root underneath it that's pushing up, and that concrete, the weakest spot is the spot that the cracks occurred. That's this mountain shifting. Now, this is hugely important because what it does is it divides the Americas into basically the area west and the area east. What it also means to a certain extent is this west-east zone is controlled at least part climatically by virtue of these mountain ranges. It also means too, in a large part, what you get is your rivers tend to drain, obviously, to east from the high point here, west from this area. This is what's called the Great Divide in Northern California. You notice in South America, that west-east gap is a lot narrower. That mountain range is pretty much to the west. But what it means is everything drains this way. And this, of course, is what you see in Brazil here. If you look at the Amazonas or Amazon River, and notice this enormous network of stuff all stacked up against these mountains. Now, the other thing to remember is, like their counterparts in the rest of the world, this must have been taking a really high summer, because what you're going to get is the vast majority of these things, like you see here with the ice packs, are basically covered in ice. So this means that for part of the year, you get the huge amounts of snow and ice on these things. When it gets warmer, that water, that melts into water and that drains. So you end up with sort of a controlled water flow. Now, if you think about it, this is what you don't have here, because you don't have mountains. And you don't have it over here where you have mountains, but it's much more tropical. So what that means, especially in the cases we'll see in North America, that you end up with persistent rivers year round. You don't end up with a monsoon system. Even South America, you don't really have a monsoon system, with persistent rivers. And also because of that, because these are much more recent pieces of real estate, it tends to vary all up-down parts. So you end up with sections that might be sort of flat, but nothing like this old piece of real estate here. So you end up with fairly fast-moving rivers, a lot of river drainages, and these mountain systems which sort of control and dominate a lot of the climate, a lot of the weather. Now, of course, just in virtue of the size of this, since they're actually connected by this one sort of feature, so actually by virtue of comparison to any place else, it's a huge piece of real estate when you actually look at these things as like a package deal. That's a lot of the planet that you're looking at here. And so it's important sometimes to think of them as being one. It's also obviously, as in many cases, pretty logical to break them off into two continental land masses. Now, sort of the stepchild of all this is here to the east. Because what you have here is you have another one of these plates. This is the North Atlantic plate. This is moving slowly, as I remember. So this area here, which is actually part of this, is being pulled to the west. And so what you have in this situation is this is folding over, and that's causing stress. Here, what you have, it's being pulled away, and that's causing stress. And the recent massive earthquakes in Puerto Rico, the volcanic eruptions in this whole region, which are real common, that's a reflection of the fact that you can almost see this pulling away phenomena here. And so even the Caribbean is a reflection of this, sort of result of the movement of tectonic plates, which here is probably more spectacular, just because they're basically packaged or sandwiched between two slower moving plates that right now are pretty much underwater. So that's your main aspect of that. So if we go to the Latin American part, we notice we sort of got two sections here. You've got the main continental mass, that'd be South America. You've got this basic just flooded mountain range area here, which is basically the Central America region, not surprisingly, not very imaginatively named, I guess. And then you've got the Caribbean. Now the Caribbean region is a whole slew of these small islands. Originally were part of this landmass. They broke off. They didn't keep up, but they were. So you can sort of see, if you visualize this, you could actually take this and sort of stick that in here. So what happened is, some point in the past, this got sort of hung up, if you want to think about it that way. It sort of pulled and pulled north. You can see this, the snap right here. So it's still attached, but it's sort of flopping around. These guys used to be, I think, in here somewhere. And again, you can see sort of the pulling, the stretch marks, if you would. It just got stretched out to here. This also is probably one of the most famous aspects of this, is the massive meteorite hit in, I don't know, you have to go check. I can't remember if it's down here or up here. I'm going to say up near Belize, which is responsible for, assumed to be responsible for the enormous climate changes, I believe, in the Jurassic or whatever period, when the dinosaurs took a hit, which might have something to do with this breaking off of these pieces. I'm not really too sure about the timing of all that. Now, the thing you have to remember is you got the equator coming across here. So in the case of North America, the vast majority of North America is temperate and full up here into the Arctic. In the case of the Caribbean, it's almost entirely, in fact, it is entirely in the tropical zone, which puts it in the same area region pretty much as this. The large chunk of South America is in the tropical zone. So if you notice, these two are like flips of each other. The mass is to the north, which means it's a more mild climate, it's cold, etc. The mass is to the north rather than being down here. So the majority of the South American continent is in a tropical climate, if you would think of a classic jungle environment. You can see this with the case of Brazil. If you're Brazil, roughly half the country is drier, half the country is basically in your classic tropical jungle situation. Places like Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, all have massive amounts of jungle, or some cases, especially in case of Peru, we tend to think of Peru in terms of its mountain or west coast area, the drier part. So this means that when you're looking at South America, this is one of the major differences between the South American region and the North American region, is literally the amount of rainfall. Because what this means is there's a lot of different problems or different situations, and maybe even options, that you have down here that you wouldn't have further north by virtue of the different climatic zones that you find yourself in. You also notice when you look at the South American states, they radically vary from one to the other in terms, or I should say Latin American countries, in terms of how they access both dry land, tropical lands, and also this mountain system. Chile, for example, is almost entirely defined by the mountain range. Argentina, for example, on the other hand, is a much more complicated, varied piece of real estate. Bolivia, for example, is all pretty much incredibly high, since it's all part of the eastern fold of the Andes Mountains here. So this means these countries have a real sort of complex situations that makes them really radically different from one another, which I don't think, again, when you look at the United States talking about this stuff, we tend to talk about the rest of the Americas, which is, about ethnocentric as you can get, as if they're like a package deal, like Venezuela is like Peru, is like Chile, when the reality is they've got, pretty stunningly different situations. The one thing they do have in common, and one reason why it's called Latin America, is when the Europeans come across here, specifically the Spanish who are trying to get to China, can't go this way because the Portuguese have already conquered that. And so, of course, the famous movement of Columbus, and then later Spanish explorers, or just whatever you want to call them, sailing across here and trying to get to here this way. And of course, he runs into this small speed bump called the Caribbean, and then, of course, the Americas in general. So what happens is, by virtue of the Spanish control of the oceans, or this part of the oceans in the 1600s, 1600s, is the Spanish end up being the folks that both, quote, discover, since there are millions and millions of people living here, this region, but also are the folks that basically claim it as colonies. So what you find is the areas that ironically were seen as the most wealthy, both by virtue of population and also what the Spanish considered key resources like gold and such, precious minerals, where there was this area here. So the Spanish very quickly grabbed this area, turned it into colonial possessions. They're not as interested in this area because they can't figure out any way to make money about it. And that pretty much was the definition of the Spanish Empire. If you can make money off it, it's a good idea. If you can't make money of it, to hell with it. Which is one reason why they don't mess with the African region. So this area literally is called Latin America. That should be called Spanish America, since the Latins don't have anything to do with it. But it's basically the part of the Americas that the Spanish had as their empire. Now, this would be sort of a trivial pursuit thing, but the Spanish keep this as part of an empire from roughly early 1500s right into the early 19th century. So for what, 300 plus years, this is all under control of this little dinky-doo country over here. And they just exploit the crap out of it. The Spanish were probably the most brutal colonizers of the European colonialization period. Well, Belgians might run sort of close with this, but Spanish are just dealing with a much larger chunk of real estate. To give you an example, in places like this area, in this part of Mexico, since they're after silver and gold, but especially silver and stuff, they managed to genocide just by virtue of intentional overuse and then intentional just getting rid of people. Wipe out probably 60 to 80% of the population of Indians in this part of the world in the space of less than 100 years. They wipe out almost the entire population in this area in the same period of time. They do the same thing everywhere else that they're at. And ironically, this is one reason why you see the slave trade starting up of importing human bodies from here to here. It's literally, for example, the Spanish need slaves here because they've killed off all the Indians. You had millions of people living here. The Spanish burned through them like a blowtorch. And then they need bodies to run the mines or whatever else they've got going. So they ship out people from here to replace the people they wiped out. So the slave trade wasn't bringing people into empty areas. The slave trade was bringing people to places you'd emptied. This is also true here. For example, this part of North America, this part of the United States, was heavily slaved. Both the Spanish, the French, and even the British slaved the Native American or Indian populations in this region for use on sale. When they ran out of Indians and they had to import labor from Africa to replace the Indian labor they'd burned through. The most striking of this is when we get into this area. Oops. Sorry about that. When we get into the Caribbean, this is probably one of the most sort of grim stories in this whole sort of saga of colonization in the Americas. The Spanish take over most of this area. Other sections end up by virtue of a set of political games. They go to the Dutch. I can't remember which of these is the Dutch areas. The Portuguese have a few spots. The French have some spots, Montserrat, for example. The British end up with some Jamaica, for example. The Spanish control the vast majority of these. In all of this region, the desire to make money, which gets pretty much defined as sugar and other plantation systems by the 1600s, means that you go through people like water. In all of this area, what you had was a general attitude the Europeans brought with them. The people that lived in the Americas were actually animals. So therefore, for example, if you're a Spanish conquistador or something for like that. So for Veracruz as a province to manage, you're given all the property that makes up that area. So he'll give you a map and say you own everything from here to here. You own the water, you own all the animals. And in the animals includes the Indians. The Indians weren't considered the same as a donkey or anything else. They were just a trapped animal. So therefore, you wouldn't be talking about human rights abuse to these guys. You'd be talking about Society for the French, SPCA. All the animals included the human animals. So in this part of the world, between disease and just slaving the population literally to death, you end up with almost the entire population that originally was in the Caribbean disappearing by the early mid-1600s, at which point you then have to ship in slaves from Africa to replace the people you killed off because you were trying to make money and didn't give a squat about how they survived. And this is the populations you see in the Caribbean today. You see this very complex mix of folks who were part of 3 or 4 different Indian populations that originally inhabited here, unfortunately at the time the Spanish arrived, who then get largely replaced by these new immigrants that are brought in to work these places. But the key thing that makes this area distinctively different than, for example, Hawaii, is that the folks that manage this area, and that includes all this region, the folks that manage this area largely stay here. Most of the plantation owners, whether it be British, French, Spanish, whatever in the Caribbean, never leave home. They send out guys to work for them, to manage them for them. But they, in many cases, never have visited, even today. the larger plantations, for example, Jamaica or stuff. And you'll find that the folks that actually own those plantations haven't even visited them in maybe 100 or 200 years. They make the money off of them to hire someone to do it for them. But it's almost like these become like a franchise. And that's the reality of life in the Caribbean. So life in the Caribbean is one where you've had replaced populations. Probably one of the more striking aspects from an environmental standpoint is while the marine environment is partially intact, when you look at the land environment, what you find on the physical landscape here, it's almost entirely replaced. If you want to know what this part of the world looked like when Columbus landed here, you're not going to find it by walking this landscape, because this landscape has been entirely replaced. Almost everything you see in terms of plants and animals has been imported either from the mainland, i.e. South America or Central America, or from Europe or from some other place. For example, if you ever go do a Google search on the Mutiny on the Bounty is a British ship which is basically hired to go and take breadfruits and other plants from Tahiti and ship them over here to Jamaica so that they can replant those with Pacific Island tropical plants so that there's food for the slaves, which the whole voyage ends up being a huge fiasco, but nonetheless, it's very typical of this type of thing. This whole area was basically modified. So when you look at the landscape in someplace like Haiti or the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, you're not looking at indigenous plants. There's almost nothing left of your indigenous landscape, or even your landscape at the time of European contact. It's almost entirely modified. And this has huge impacts because even things like a national forest, for example, here is a national forest, but it's not an indigenous national forest, much of it. This is strikingly different than what you see when you get to the mainland areas. Well, that's not true in the mainland parts of the Americas, which are pretty much, if not intact, they're much more durable, I guess would be a way to put it. But it means when you look at environmental impacts, we tend to think of that as a recent thing. Oh, you know, we've changed so much of the land, we've changed so many of the plants and animals. But you have to remember, this is the 1600s, 1700s, 1700s. Europeans were really good at making a mess of stuff really, really early on. And what you find is a lot of your environmental problems in this region today, and there's a ton of them, are in part due to the fact that you've got plants and animals which have no history and time and place in actually being part of this landscape. And also means to a certain extent, when you look at the populations here, is they're not particularly integrated into the landscape in many cases because they really haven't been there for very long. There's very few stories, for example, if you go into the Haiti Dominican Republic, you find there's very few oral traditions in this area that actually talk about the old names. In fact, if you look here, there's almost no names here which actually look Indian, versus we go see a fair number of Spanish names, but a lot of these are actually, you know, sort of Spanish reinterpretations of, in this case, Mayapan, or Mayan language names. Utalapa, for example, Ocotal. These are all names of the populations that lived and in fact still live here, Choluteca. So if you get into the Americas, you find that a lot of the names that people have are actually reflective of the continuing relationship people have with the land. Zacatecas, for example, Tlacopete. Those are all names that have been there for, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of years. You're not going to find that here. These are all European names. They're all from places in Spain or, you know, somewhere in the Spanish Empire. Almost none of these places would be recognizable if you went back, you know, 500 years and asked a Carrie or Arawak Indian, who are the folks in this area, what was this place called? You know, they wouldn't know what the hell you're talking about. It's just entirely different. It's an entirely European modified world, either directly or indirectly. And this is one of the really important things to remember about the Caribbean, is it's really just undergone enormous amounts of environmental, social, you know, social change in the last 400 years, which makes it really sort of an interesting place to look at when you look at it with that understanding in place, that you're not looking at the past, you're sort of looking like a recent past, heavily modified version of what's going on. El Nino, La Nina, go Google those if you want to see them. It just has to do with the fact that you get in the Pacific these circular changes in terms of warm and cold conditions in the atmosphere based on the ocean conditions. And that leads to climatic change in the Americas. Also affects us, obviously, not surprisingly, since we're in the Pacific. I mean, the Caribbean, when you think about it, sort of got it here. If you look at this, you know, if you just drop off the last 4 letters, what you've got is actually the name of the Indian population that controlled this whole region at this time of the Spanish arrival. They're the folks that were unfortunately around when Columbus shows up, and they basically vanish. We know very little about the Caraibes, for example. The Arawaks are still around, ironically, not in the Caribbean, but in coastal areas of Venezuela. But the Caraibes are pretty much gone. There's still some remnant populations, I believe, in Nicaragua or somewhere down in here. But they pretty much vanished. They used to control pretty much this entire region of the world. It just gives you some idea of how absolutely devastating, how complete the European modification of the Caribbean was. Probably sort of a minor side effect, I think we'll stop with this, is when you look at this, is if on one hand you have the Spanish controlling the vast majority of this area, the other European powers that take the pieces of the pie are still around. This is one of the interesting aspects, is you know, in the case of the United States, for example, since Hawaii is a state, the largest chunk of colonial possessions the United States has, we don't like to call them that, call them territories, but they're colonies, would be Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. All of this area here, with a few exceptions, there's a couple of these that are independent, but the vast majority of this region is still European colonies. And this makes for some really strange situations. St. Kitts or somewhere in here. I can never remember. Oh yeah, this must be the Dutch part here. Looks like Philipsburg and Gustavia. Oh no, it is St. Kitts Nevis. So what you have is the Dutch still control this area, which is sort of odd when you think about it. Since Holland, I mean, Holland used to be a big deal. They're not exactly, you know, players in a global, whatever anymore. So you find the Caribbean in some ways is almost like a time machine, I guess. A lot of the stuff in the rest of the world would be very 19th century, you know, colonies, remote control. When they had the huge hurricane, it was last year or the year before, the British government poured in huge amounts of resources to help out the Virgin Islands, which got totally flattened. The United States, of course, got a huge amount of gas for not doing the same for Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. So what you find is, in some ways, it still looks like the 19th century. There's a lot of European flags flying here. There's a lot of European territories. Something which you don't see, ironically, even here. Most of the rest of the world, the colonies are gone. Even in the Pacific, you've got the French around. Of course, the Americans are around. But everyone else is pretty much gone. The Brits are pretty much gone. And everyone else is pretty much, they've ditched, they've vanished. Not in the Caribbean. Caribbean, a lot of it's still sort of same old, same old. And this makes, I never quite figured out why. For most of the European countries, keeping colonies here is incredibly expensive. I don't know what to get out of it. The French have practical reasons why they want to keep French Guiana. They use it as missile range and a whole mess of other stuff. But even then, they don't really make any money out of it. It costs them a ton of money. So the Europeans are still playing, if you would, at the 19th century. They're still playing at the time when they controlled the planet. And this is what they do with the Caribbean. A lot of the Caribbean is their last play toy, you might think, last left in their toy box. And that's makes life very complicated for this region. Now, the other part, just like the Pacific, is, of course, that you've got these island nations, Haiti and Dominican Republic especially, that are, you know, not particularly large in land area. They're not particularly useful. In other words, there's not a lot of mineral resources or anything to make money out of. They originally, of course, were all largely into sugar. To a certain extent bananas, but pretty much sugar. And the whole problem with that is, of course, that there's so many different ways to make sugar. You make sugar out of beets, you make sugar out of corn, you make sugar out of all sorts of stuff. And so what's happened is where these guys used to be fairly wealthy because they were the big sugar areas, Jamaica especially, Haiti, Dominican Republic. Now the vast majority of sugar is grown here in the central part of the United States by massive agricultural businesses. So the end result is these guys can't compete. And the problem they've got is they really don't have alternatives to that. You have a few places like Jamaica, which is we'll see have been able to sort of define themselves in terms of tourism. But a lot of the rest of this area just, that hasn't worked out as well as they hoped it would. And as we've seen in Hawaii, especially with the COVID-19 case, and I'm sure it must be absolutely devastating here, is that's tourism, as we've seen globally, is such a fragile economic thing to depend on. Look at Hawaii. That once that finally gets smacked, once something happens and they get screwed up, then you're really, really completely up the creek. And so this area pretty much got a double whammy. The tourism is the one business, but only some areas can take advantage of that. Their other business would be sugar, and to be honest, no one's interested anymore. So they're sort of stuck in a situation. Much of this area has pretty dense populations, so it tends to be overpopulated. There's not a lot of agriculture because it was all into sugar. It's very hard to convert a sugar plantation into plant foods. I think what we tried to do here in the middle of the island here. So, you know, what you've got is an overpopulated area, not a lot of food resources, not a lot of ways to generate money. And so they pretty much ended up marginalized. Now, of course, what's really frustrating for them is you've got this very, relatively speaking, wealthy region. Mexico's pretty well off. The United States, of course, is well off. Some of your South American countries are actually in pretty good shape, with the exception of Venezuela. Even that's political. So what you've got is they're surrounded by places that are in much better shape, most cases economically. Or even if they're not, they have the potential for being in better shape. And yet these guys don't have a lot of options. You know, if you're at Cuba right now, Cuba is sort of stuck in a horrible situation. You've got a large population. You don't really have anything the rest of the world wants to buy. You don't really have much in the way of tourism. You have some, but not near what you would like to have. And, you know, you find now what do you do? You've got a large population that needs something. People want to make money. They want to be part of the world they see. I mean, Christ, they almost swim over here. So they see all this stuff in the world they'd love to be a part of. For some reason, they love the idea of Miami. And yet you really can't access it. So to a certain extent, you see a somewhat similar phenomenon like we saw in the case of sub-Saharan Africa. You don't have access to the parts of the world that you feel like you should have access to. And you don't feel like it's your fault, which it's not. You know, but you don't know, no one has an answer. Everyone just goes like, oh, so sad, too bad. And that's not an answer, it's just a bad sympathy letter. So let's sort of stop with that, but that gets us into the puzzle of this part of the world.